What are two major components of a strong deadlift and a healthy back? Number one, a great hip hinge, and number two, a strong set back. This is Jake Bully with BarBend.com, and today we're going to be talking about the 3 best deadlift progressions for beginners. The kettlebell deadlift off an elevated surface is an awesome training tool for the deadlift beginner. It teaches you how to set the back and hip hinge in a limited range of motion so it doesn't overload the posterior chain too quickly. So 3 keys that come along with this movement. The setup. Number one, stack about 2 45-pound plates on top of each other. That can vary a little bit depending on what you have available and your level of fitness. Set the kettlebell on the very edge of the plates. This allows you to get a similar stance that you would use in a normal deadlift. Number two, when we set for the deadlift, we're going to push our hips back, feeling tension in the hamstrings and the glutes. We're going to pull those scaps nice and back and tight with the lats, and then we're going to take a big belly breath at the bottom and bring it all the way up while squeezing our glutes and fully extending the hips. So key 3 is the descent. So if you're brand new to this movement, or deadlifting for that matter, and you're kind of iffy on your hip hinge, a good way to track that is to watch and see as the hips go back and your back is staying set, is that deadlift remaining in the same spot where it started? If it is, that's a good indication that you're performing this correctly and you're having a nice clean path. If it's coming out a little far or a little bit too in, you might need to check out your hip hinge. Our next beginner deadlift progression is the kettlebell deadlift from the floor. Now that we've conquered a strong hip hinge, we're learning how to set our back, we're learning how to breathe properly. Now let's add a little bit more range of motion. This is going to more closely replicate what a normal deadlift looks like. So 3 keys to this movement. So as opposed to being set on the edge of the plates, a good way to set with a kettlebell deadlift is to kind of think about how it's going to set on the midfoot compared to like what a normal barbell would be. This is going to vary slightly. I like to set mine a little bit more forward because I have longer legs, but midfoot tends to be the best bet. We're going to bend down, pulling those lats back, staying nice and tight, pushing those hips back, maintaining that nice strong back angle. We're going to take a big belly breath at the bottom. We're going to lift up, keeping nice tight hip extension with the glutes tight. And as we return, we're going to be really mindful of pushing those hips back, maintaining that strong hip hinge, and keeping that back nice and set. Similar to our first progression, a good way to track this to see if you're doing it properly is to watch where the kettlebell is placing. If it's coming so far back or so far forward, you might be having a little bit of flexion in the torso, or your hip hinge might be too shallow or too deep, and that's one good way to kind of check if you're doing it properly. All right, so for a visual of a set back and a hip hinge and a deadlift, one way to kind of check if you're a beginner, if you're doing this correctly, and also just to kind of see it, is to grab a dowel or a long object. I have a yardstick here, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna turn to our side here, place it in between our glutes and maintaining contact with our upper back, and then we're gonna hinge forward, pushing the hips back, maintaining that nice strong set back. And what we're looking for here is any kind of lack of contact of the upper back and the glutes. If we feel that our upper back is coming off as we're bending down, that's a good indicator that one, we're either hinging too shallow or we're not hinging properly, or we're having excessive flexion of the lumbar or thoracic. Now, if that's hard to do on your own, then I recommend finding a coach to kind of watch and teach you the hinge. That's always a little bit better than a self-check, but for a visual, that's one way you can kind of check yourself. All right, so our final deadlift beginner progression is the trap bar deadlift. This movement is awesome because it kind of ties into a squat and deadlift. The hip hinge isn't going to be completely similar to a barbell deadlift, but it does help you kind of really maintain that strong angle and load the hips a little bit heavier and the hamstrings a little bit heavier than you would with the other progressions we've used. So now, in terms of a successful trap bar deadlift, there are 3 keys to remember. Number one, get the stance that's going to be similar to what you would have in a deadlift. That might vary a little bit depending on how big the trap bar is, but find what's most comfortable for you that allows you to really get a nice strong knee angle and set the hips and back. As we bend down, we're going to maintain that tension in the hamstrings, the glutes, maintain that strong hip hinge, and then we're going to pull those lats back, making sure the scapula are nice and depressed. We're going to take a big belly breath with a strong set back. We're going to lift. At the top, we're going to squeeze our glutes, make sure our hips are fully extending, our upper back is nice and tight so that bar is not pulling us forward. And now as we descend, we're going to push the hips back, thinking similar to how we would in a normal deadlift. We're going to keep that nice strong upper back angle. And a good way to check if you're doing these correctly is to make sure the bar is landing in the same place. A good place to start is with the midfoot. If that's varying at all forward or back, there might be a little bit of variance in your flexion of the torso or hip hinge for that matter, and you might need to kind of either scale back the weight or check your form. That's one easy way to do so on your own. So let's say you don't have a trap bar readily available. Then one variation you could do is try to stack plates on each side of you, similar to the width of a normal trap bar, and using dumbbells. Now, you're not gonna be able to load this similarly to the trap bar deadlift, and it might feel a little bit different, but it's gonna be pretty dang close to what a normal trap bar deadlift would feel like. One tip that I would recommend is doing all the same in terms of the movement with this lift, but being a little bit slower on the eccentric or the descending portion. Why do this? Well, for starters, we can't load this as heavily as the normal trap bar, so we still want to get a nice time under tension, but also, since the deadlifts can vary and wiggle a little bit, having a nice slow tempo will help us put those down flatly before setting, breathing, and taking our next rep. And that wraps up our best deadlift progressions for beginners video. If you're ready for the next step and you're ready for the barbell, make sure to check out our guide that has visuals by Googling BarBend and deadlift.